Hi class, how are you today? Pop goes the weasel. The learning target for today is to be able to solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So we've learned about solving quadratic equations in a couple different ways, and now we're going to learn the quadratic formula. Some people think the quadratic formula is the easiest way to solve quadratics. Some prefer some of the other methods. But no matter what, you can always use the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation. Where in some of the other methods, such as factoring or the square root method, you can only use them in specific situations. Quadratic formula you can use for any quadratic. The scale for today is you're a 3 if you can solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. You're a 2 if you can solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula when the roots are rational and the roots are the answers. So when the equation is 0, the roots are what the answers are. So if they're rational, so they're not irrational, so they don't have a square root, or they're not imaginary or complex, so they don't have I in them, then you're a 2 if you can solve those types of answers. So they're rational, so they're either the answer is a regular fraction or an integer. You're a 1 if you can set up the quadratic formula, so you can set it up but you have trouble actually solving it out and simplifying it. And you're a 0 if you cannot set up the quadratic formula. Let's get started. All right, so some people have a little bit of a difficulty knowing the difference between a quadratic equation and the quadratic formula. So a quadratic equation is the ones we've been dealing with trying to solve, and it's usually written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are constants, numbers, the coefficients in front of those variables, and c is the constant by itself, the number that's by itself. The quadratic formula is the formula you can use to solve a quadratic. And so it essentially solves the quadratic equation for x. And all you have to do is plug in a, b, and c into it. And so the quadratic formula, as you can see here, is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to take the numbers of a, b, and c and plug them into that formula. And it kind of differs. Some people really remember that pretty well, and of all the things they remember in math, they remember the quadratic formula out of anything else, even though it is kind of difficult and has a lot of stuff going on. But some people, a lot of people, probably struggle to remember it. So one way I learned to help remember it is to put it in a song. And I was once told that you can sing the quadratic formula to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. And so it goes, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if that helps, I hope it helps. Otherwise, I just sang to you, and well, I hope that was fun. Anyway, let's solve number 1. And so number 1, well, we'll notice that we're supposed to have equals 0, but we don't have equals 0. We have equals 11. So we need to bring the 11 over to the left side. So we'll subtract 11 from both sides. And so that'll give us x squared minus 10x minus 11 equals 0. And so now we can figure out what A, B, and C are. So I'll write it right out. A is the number in front of x squared, which is 1, because there's nothing there, so we say 1 is in front. B is the number in front of x, and that's negative 10. Don't forget the negative. And then C is the number by itself. So in this case, it's negative 11. Again, don't forget the negative. And now we can plug that all into the quadratic formula. X equals negative b, and b is negative 10, so negative negative 10, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 10 squared, minus 4ac, so minus 4 times a, which is 1, and times c, which is negative 11. And then all over 2a, which is 1. So we can simplify this a little bit. Negative negative 10 is positive 10, plus or minus the square root of negative 10 squared is 100. Don't forget that a negative squared is positive. Minus 4 times 1 times negative 11. So that'll give us positive 44. And then all over 2 times 1, which is 2. And we can simplify that a little bit farther. 10 plus or minus the square root of 100 plus 44 is 144, all over 2. And then we have x equals 10 plus or minus the square root of 144 is 12, and then all over 2. So we can rewrite this equation as two separate equations, and we need to do that because we have the plus or minus. So we're going to have x equals 10 plus 12 over 2, and we're going to have x equals 10 minus 12 over 2. And so x equals 10 plus 12 is 22 over 2, which is 11. And then we have 10 minus 12, so x equals negative 2 over 2, which is negative 1. And so these are our answers. And remember that we do need both of them. We write or, but we do need both of them. We just write or because it can't be 11 and negative 1 at the same time. All right, for this next example, we're going to do the same thing. So again, it doesn't equal 0, so we need to make it equal 0. So add 10 to both sides, and x squared minus 6x plus 10 equals 0. And so now we find out what a, b, and c are. A, again, is 1. B is negative 6. And c is 10. Then we plug this all in to the quadratic formula. So x equals negative negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10. All over 2 times 1. So x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 40 all over 2. And so x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 over 2. And so we can simplify that square root. X equals 6 plus or minus. And remember, it's a square root of a negative. So that means we're going to need I. We're going to need an imaginary number. So the square root of negative 4 is 2I. And then over 2. And so now we can simplify this. And you can write this a few different ways, but it might be helpful to split it up and say x equals 6 over 2 plus 2I over 2, and x equals 6 over 2 minus 2I over 2. And so what I did there was I split it up, the plus or minus, into 2 different equations, but I also took the over 2 for all of it being divided by 2 and instead made each thing divided by 2. So I distributed the dividing by 2. And 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 2I divided by 2 is I. And then we have 6 divided by 2 is 3, and minus 2I divided by 2 is I. So we can say or in between, and these would be our answers. I would also accept x equals 3 plus or minus I. If you wanted to keep the plus or minus as your answer, that's fine too. You can split it up if you want, or you can leave it as plus or minus. Both answers are acceptable. Alright, now time for the sponge activity. I want you to solve each equation using the quadratic formula. So number 1 is x squared plus 6x equals 16, and number 2 is x squared minus 4x equals negative 13. Alright, that's it for this lesson. Once again, please make sure to take notes on the entire lesson, take a picture of everything, submit it all to Google Classroom, and have a good night.